We had a number of recommendations relating to media. We recommended the government fund regional and rural media that was a bit under threat, and they did that. We asked them to keep funding, because one of the major ways government supports media in Australia is by funding the Australian Broadcasting Commission as well as the Special Broadcasting Service, and that is being done. And we also talked about tax exemption status for people donating to media, and that wasn't picked up. But I run through those just to show there was a suite of recommendations that we made relating to media, and one of those was the News Media Bargaining Code, which the government did accept. So what we had seen in the course of our study, which caused us to recommend a News Media Bargaining Code, was that Google and Facebook had massive market power. They were using the content of media businesses without paying for it. The media businesses tried to get payment, but they got nowhere. What we found was that Facebook and Google needed news media content on their platform. They desperately did, but they did not need the content of any one media entity. But on the other hand, each media entity needed to be on Google and Facebook for their survival. So Google and Facebook didn't need any particular media entity, so they could say, look, if you don't like our terms, go away. But each media entity needed to be on Google and Facebook. So that led, in our view, to an imbalance in bargaining power. We described that as a market failure, which we felt was important. Obviously, as economists, we can understand there's a lot of market failures in our economies, but this one really mattered because it was a market failure that was having a damaging effect on media, on journalism, and therefore on society, because we certainly were very clear that journalism is fundamental to a well-functioning society. And so that's why this issue had to be addressed, and that was the logic we put forward to address it. And as I say, the government accepted the recommendation. Initially, the government suggested that there be a voluntary code that would attempt to see agreement between Google and Facebook on the one hand and the news media businesses on the other. Behind that was a threat that if the voluntary code didn't work, there might need to be stronger action. The negotiations started in very early January. By March, the government asked for the ACCC's view. How's it going? We gave the view to the government that we did not think these negotiations were going to achieve a financial outcome that we thought was in any way appropriate, that wasn't a topic being much discussed. So in April, the government directed the ACCC to draft a code, a news media bargaining code. So we were given that task. We worked closely with the Department of Communications, the Minister for Communications, which Emma McDonald was then on the staff of, and also the Treasury Department. And we put out a draft code in July. That was for discussion, very much a draft. We put out, on the basis of that discussion, another draft in November. And finally, the legislation was passed in February. As is probably well known, there was a lot of brinkmanship associated with the code getting legislated. Google said that if this code is legislated, they would withdraw search services from Australia. As soon as they did that, the chief executive of Microsoft was talking to our Prime Minister and said, don't worry about losing Google search. Bing can come to your country and provide a wonderful service. So that led to a bit of that didn't play out as Google expected, and they dropped that essentially back down. Facebook took a different approach. They just took all news off their Facebook site. I just woke up one morning to find that announcement. The problem for Facebook was they overplayed their hand. They not only took down all news, but they took down bushfire warnings when there was actually a bushfire going on in Western Australia. They took down medical warnings when there was a COVID crisis and other medical issues. And so this generated a big backlash against Facebook, people saying, well, we'll get off Facebook if this is the way they're going to treat us. So eventually Facebook backed down as well. But in the course of those threats and that action, that triggered final negotiations between the Treasurer of Australia and the chief executives of Alphabet and Facebook, respectively. A range of changes to the legislation were made before it got passed. Most of them were not of great substance. I guess the one of most importance for us was the government agreed that if Facebook and Google went out and did deals with media businesses, then Facebook and Google would not be designated under the code. So with that, the code legislation was passed. It became law in February of 2021. But the code is law. It sits there. But in a sense, to trigger the provisions I'll describe in a second, Facebook and Google needed to be designated. They didn't want to be designated simply because they didn't want the precedent. They wanted to be able to go to every country, including yours, and say, the code doesn't apply to us. We were never designated. That is a misrepresentation. To avoid designation, they went out and did a lot of deals with media businesses very quickly. So in a sense, the objective of the code was not to have the legislation take effect. It was not to have arbitration, which I'll come to in a second. It was not to see designation. The objective of the code was to get deals done between media businesses and Google and Facebook, and that's what happened. So the objective of the code was completely met. There's three key provisions of the code that matter, a whole lot of them really, but only three really matter. One is that there's provision for negotiation and arbitration. So the parties are required to negotiate. If negotiation doesn't work, there's provision for arbitration. Now, the point of that is that there is a bargaining power imbalance. So just having a voluntary requirement to negotiate does not achieve much. But having the ability to go to arbitration, that evens up the bargaining position between the parties, because if you are a monopoly, Google is 95% of search in Australia, you can say, no, I'm not going to negotiate. But, and now we've got a cat joining the scene. But if Google knows that the media businesses have the ability to go to arbitration to get an arbitrated outcome, then Google has every reason to negotiate, and they did. So arbitration was absolutely fundamental. So you have to negotiate, but there is compulsory arbitration. It was also final offer arbitration, where each side puts in their bid to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator selects one bid over the other. The purpose of that is to avoid ambit claims. I mean, if the arbitrator is meant to come up with their own view, then, Google will offer nothing, the media business will ask for something ridiculous, and the arbitrator's left having to basically determine the outcome. We thought there just wasn't the information to do that, so we said final offer arbitration, which would force the parties together, and if somebody came up with a really stupid, outlandish thing, they'd get ignored, and so this, because neither party would want that to happen, you'd have sensible bids. So negotiate, arbitrate was one characteristic. Secondly, this wasn't a must-carry regime. That is, Google and Facebook were not required to do all this. But if they did a deal with one media business, they had to do a deal with them all. So it's up to them whether they wanted to have any news on Google search or Facebook. But if they did have one, they had to negotiate with everybody, and everybody had the right to go to arbitration in relation to that deal. So fundamental provision, number two. And thirdly, the right to collectively bargain, because there's a whole lot of little players who are too small, even with the ability to go to arbitration. They just don't have the firepower, and so they could get together and collectively bargain. So that's the essential provisions of the code. As I say, what the government conceded in response to Google and Facebook's various threats and actions was that, okay, we won't trigger all that if you go out and do deals. That was the compromise. And the good news from the government's point of view is they did. So the government achieved what it wanted to achieve, which is must never be forgotten. The code has been successful. It got what it wanted to achieve. So in terms of outcomes, over $200 million per year. I think it's well over $200 million per year has been paid each year, every single year, 3, 4, 5-year deals by Google and Facebook combined. Google eventually did deals with essentially all media businesses in Australia that could possibly be eligible. There's a bit of debate about one or two small ones, but basically they did deals with everybody. Facebook did deals with news media businesses that probably employ about 85% of Australian journalists. Maybe it's more than that. It's hard to get good data, but they did a deal with just about everybody, large, medium, and small. Australia has 4 large media businesses, has, 5, 6, 7 medium-sized businesses, and has a large array of small ones. Google did a deal essentially with them all. Facebook did a deal with virtually all. So just to deal with a couple of the criticisms of the code. Some have criticised the code because it doesn't solve all of journalism's problems. My response to that, it was never meant to. It was part of a suite of recommendations to help journalism. We believe there was a need for government grants to go to certain types of journalism. We believe there was a need to keep funding the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission, and the SBS, and there are a range of other things. So it was meant to deal with that inability to bargain with Facebook and Google, who were benefiting from journalistic content but not paying for it. That's the only thing it was meant to deal with. Very, very narrow objective, which was achieved. The second criticism, which is one being very much fomented by Google and Facebook, was that this only benefited the large players. But that's just factually incorrect. It's just completely wrong. As I say, Google's done a deal with everybody. Facebook's done a deal with large, medium, and small. I guess some of the small players who didn't have a deal with Facebook, and a couple who think they should get a deal with Google but haven't, controversial as to whether they should or shouldn't. They complain they've been left out, but really large, medium, and small players have got deals. And there's been a number of bits of collective bargaining Country Press Australia represents the smallest newspapers in the country. I mean, some of these have got 2 or 3 journalists in small country towns. They got together. I mean, they were lucky they had an umbrella organisation to begin with, but they got together and collectively bargained and got a very good deal. Indeed, I would say, in my experience, that the smaller players got considerably more money per journalist employed than the larger players. Certainly, Country Press Australia got a very, very good deal. And then the other issue is transparency. People felt that the deal should have been made public. Sorry, some have alleged that the criticism being the deal should have been made public. My view is that's not right. All we're trying to do here, and this is the key point, was even up the bargaining position. So suppose Google didn't have a monopoly and you didn't have this bargaining imbalance, they'd have just done deals anyway. And no one would have known what was in the deal. I mean, companies are doing deals all the time and no one knows what's in them. Yes, this was facilitated by legislation, but just to even up the bargaining power. This is not government decreeing what the outcome is. Where I think the transparency argument has some merit is that the only people who know what the deals are is the ACCC. We know them all because we were in contact with all the media businesses. And so we're the ones, I'm no longer with the ACCC, of course, but we're the ones who know it was considerably more than $200 million. And we know that to be true. I mean, we absolutely have the data, but it's all confidential data. And, that probably can be addressed. So just to finish up, the News Media Bargaining Code is being replicated in Canada. Legislation's before the House, the House of Parliament in Canada. It will likely get passed early, middle of the year, 2023. It has one large improvement on the code, which is that, as it were, the governing body, which is actually the media regulator in Canada, will have all the information and publish it in broad terms. So it won't publish deals, but it will publish in aggregate. So it would then, in the Australian context, have given the ACCC the ability to aggregate the data and put it out there in a public way, which is a lot better than getting me along to tell you that it was over $200 million. So I think the Canadian change is an improvement. The United States has legislation for its parliament. We're hoping it gets passed in the lame duck period, but we don't know. So 50-50, they'll pass their legislation. It's very similar to the bargaining code. It has negotiate, arbitrate, it has collective bargaining. What it does is only apply to media below a certain size, because the media above a certain size have already got deals with Facebook and Google. Facebook and Google went out and did those deals once they saw what was happening in Australia. So the big guys got deals. The legislation in the US is for the smaller companies, and let's hope that passes. And then finally, in the UK, they are also following the News Media Bargaining Code approach. They're doing it through general legislation, which deals with a whole range of issues, including not just media. But the first thing they'll do when that legislation is passed, hopefully next year, is bring in a News Media Bargaining Code. So there needs to be legislation first, but then that will happen fairly quickly. So I think it's extremely likely the legislation will be a News Media Bargaining Code lookalike will occur in Canada, 50-50 in the US, and actually I'm fairly confident it will happen in the UK as well. So my advice to India is copy the News Media Bargaining Code. The legislation's sitting there. You can also look at the Canada legislation if you want to see another variation of it. It's not much. It's not a big variation. So you've got models there that could be adopted quite quickly rather than having to rethink the whole thing again.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.